Imagine you're an astronomer who is scanning the night sky with his telescope. You notice a strange, large patch in the sky. It's a starless region, and it kind of looks like that picture that often gets mistaken for the Bootes void. And it's getting bigger and bigger, exponentially so. Or at the very least, that's what it looks like. But upon further inspection, it actually turns out that it's getting closer and closer to us at a faster and faster rate. What would you do in this scenario? What goes through your head? Such is the story of the Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle, the astronomer who infamously dubbed the expansion of the universe the Big Bang derogatorily, as he preferred a universe that has always been in existence rather than one that had a finite existence. It's a belief actually made evident in the book at one point. A big focal point of the book is to be an accurate representation of the type of work that scientists do, so it details the type of mundane yet important work that a scientist performs. For example, the story starts off with a student named Newt Jensen. He's a university student studying in the United States on a 2-year studentship. Jensen is tasked with finding and documenting supernova by photographing the sky every day. This is the type of job that you would expect out of a junior astronomer. If he were to find a supernova, then the task would get delegated to a more seasoned astronomer with a more powerful telescope. Now, Fred Hoyle sprinkles in scientific realism throughout this book to give it a level of authenticity that wasn't generally found in the written science fiction works of the time. While some of it may seem outdated, like insinuating that the Big Bang didn't happen, it's still nice to see scientifically fluent explanations that can be logically followed by the reader. However, the book's scientific literacy isn't the most interesting aspect of the book, in my opinion, but rather it's the sociological and philosophical questions that come from it. As I prefaced earlier, the story follows a group of scientists that discover a cloud headed straight towards the solar system at an increasing rate. These findings are presented in a collaborative manner where you have two groups of scientists that both independently found this black spot in the sky. And many of them are incredulous to believe that not only did this black spot just pop into existence out of nowhere, but that it's actually headed towards us, towards the solar system at an increasing rate. After checking each other's work and performing the necessary mathematical calculations again, not just to determine its speed and its direction, but also some of its chemical composition as well, they ultimately all agree that this cloud is headed straight towards us, and it's coming at us at an alarming rate. Within about 17 months, if their calculations are correct, that cloud will be in between the sun and the earth, blocking out all of the energy and the light from the sun. Now, what happens if this is the case? Would we all freeze to death without the sun's heat? Or could the cloud actually cause more heat to get trapped within our atmosphere, burning us alive? Or maybe the effects actually won't be as bad as we feared. Well, unfortunately, this is where things get far more speculative. One of the main scientists in the story, Dr. Kingsley, gives us a grim prognosis. While our atmosphere traps heat that is used to keep us warm at night, eventually it'll dissipate, and conditions after 5 to 10 days could be similar to those on the moon. Up until this point, one of the main themes of this novel has come up. Throughout this time, the scientists have been debating and deliberating with each other regarding whether or not they should inform world leaders such as the President of the United States and the British Prime Minister. Do they let them know? Do they update them on the current status of the situation? Or do they withhold information out of fear that informing them would make the situation worse? After all, they don't even know with certainty that the cloud will come in between them and the sun and cause any real damage. They can be confident and convinced, but they recognize that they are fallible, a reality that manifests itself later on in the story as the scientists are constantly getting wrong predictions about the activity of the cloud, and they have to continuously go back to the drawing board and try again. They're tenacious, they're brilliant, but they're also human, and they recognize this. Even Kingsley recognizes this, as arrogant as he comes across in the novel. They also understand that should this cloud prove dangerous, they have to ensure that they save as many people as possible, and not just the elite upper class, a belief that is not shared by the politician. The politicians, on the other hand, are predominantly concerned with selfish self-preservation, image, popularity, and power. And if they were to gain knowledge of this cloud and wield the power to control the narrative, then how do we know that they won't do it for their own personal selfish needs? Or that out of sheer stupidity, the novel does not mince words, out of sheer stupidity the politicians will just make the wrong decisions and they will cause more lives to perish. They ultimately decide to inform the proper authorities, the United States government and the British government specifically. And they decide to keep the situation secret for now, even though the scientists are protesting given that, we could be dealing with a cataclysmic situation, so the public should know. But the politicians refuse, and so right now, they decide to keep it secret. Here you see the beginning of their clash of values. The scientists are saying that we could be dealing with an extinction level event and want the public to know. The politician, on the other hand, refuses, citing the reliability of the evidence, how they could be perceived if they turn out to be wrong, and wanting to maintain social cohesion. They come up with a plan similar to that of Los Alamos, where you have a group of scientists that are selected to tackle this problem secretly in an undisclosed location. 2 separate stations are created. You have one in the Mojave Desert in the United States, and then the other one is in Bardenstow, England. And while there might be 2 stations, the one in Bardenstow, England is viewed as the main one, since that's where Dr. Kingsley is at, and he's kind of the main story in the novel. And there's more going on in the story in terms of like the characters and their character traits and their relationships with one another, but in this video I'm mostly focused on the themes and philosophies of the book. Eventually, the cloud begins to become visible in the sky, and you started seeing headlines and everyone started talking about it. However, none of the headlines indicated anything dangerous or cataclysmic yet. After all, the only ones that have identified and studied the cloud are the ones currently working on a secret plan to potentially save humanity. As the story progresses, the clear tension between the scientist mentality and the politician's mentality continues to manifest itself. The scientists are focused on prioritizing all of humanity. No one group of people deserves preference, and certainly no one group of elite, powerful politicians deserves priority. This is at odds with the politician's mindset, in which the politicians are prioritizing the elite upper class, because at the end of the day, they're the politicians, they're the lawmakers, they're the ones that should take precedent over the general population. And if it sounds like a cliche, I mean, it is. I think this book was written in the 50s, so it's not like there's going to be anything like new or revolutionary in terms of its themes, but certainly timely, or should I say timeless. But this shows a clash of values between 2 groups of people, where you have the tribalistic values of the politician going up against the humanitarian values of the scientists. The scientists predicted that as the cloud got closer to the sun, it would accelerate. But this was at odds with what they were actually witnessing. As the cloud got closer to the sun, it actually decelerated, and it arrived at a much later date than they were expecting. But finally, the cloud arrives, and all the theories that the scientists came up with will be put to a test, as well as their consequences. At first, temperatures increased by 10 degrees, and then another 10. It eventually passes 100 degrees. I mean, people stayed inside for weeks on end. For a while, fatalities in the United States remained low, but it was when air conditioning units began to break that you started to see fatalities come about. In the tropics, the situation was much worse, as a little under 8,000 species of plants and animals became utterly extinct. At this point, around 700 million people have died. Things got increasingly worse as the temperature of the surface of the ocean increased, and it caused an increase in humidity. Eventually, clouds engulfed the earth, and it rained nonstop for 3 days. The book describes this in much more scientific terms, but I'm not a scientist, so I can only explain it to you in stupid terms. But at this point, the expert opinion is complete uncertainty regarding whether or not anyone would even survive this ordeal. And a big reason for this is that the scientists are continuously incorrectly predicting how the cloud will behave, and the politician uses this fact as ammunition to discredit them. There's a clear asymmetry here between how the scientists act and conduct themselves versus how everybody else expects them to act and conduct themselves. As I said earlier, the scientists are fallible and often get stuff wrong, but they keep trying to get the right answer even when everything seems hopeless. They present their findings to each other and build upon each other's work, but the politician expects them to always be right. They don't seem to view the scientists as fallible people with expertise, but rather they seem to view them as a tool, and if the tool isn't giving them the answers that they want, then the tool must be broken. It adds to the ongoing dilemma regarding how people think science is conducted versus how it's actually conducted with its collaborative trial and error approach. The scientists don't expect to get everything right on the first try, but everyone else seems to expect that out of them. It's as the late great Carl Sagan once said, we live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. At this point, the death toll just keeps rising, and the future for the Earth keeps looking more and more bleak. And the politicians, of course, just keep blaming the scientists for not properly preparing the Earth for this event. But one of the politicians, named Francis Parkinson, ended up living among the scientists at Nordenstow in order to document their activity. But he ended up actually gaining a better understanding of the scientific mentality and process. There's a point in the book where the British Prime Minister is ranting to Francis Parkinson about how the scientists doomed the Earth because they couldn't figure out what exactly the cloud was, and Parkinson has a pretty apt reply. He responds with, "Kingsley's report always had a gravity that we were unwilling to accept. We were always trying to persuade ourselves that things were better than they seemed. We never considered the possibility that they might be worse than they seemed. Kingsley may have been wrong, but he was nearer being right than we were." The Prime Minister then asks how they could be wrong, to which Parkinson replies, They would have told you if you'd taken the trouble to ask, instead of roaring their heads off. The disconnect between the world of science and the world of government couldn't be any clearer. The world needs science. It needs scientists. Sure, scientists can be wrong sometimes, but at least their wrongness is rooted in experience and obsession. If they're wrong, they'll just go try again. But this isn't good enough for the politician. The politician wants them to always be right. But even then, even if the scientist is right, if the answer is politically inconvenient, then they won't be heard. And I'll let you draw real-world parallels at your own discretion here. By the end of September, a couple of months after the cloud had arrived, about a quarter of the Earth's population had died. Things don't appear to be getting better either. However, after months of agony and desperation, things finally start to look a little bit better. The cloud starts to collapse and form into a disk, letting more and more sunlight in. Life actually might start returning to normal now. However, given the position of the disk and the Earth's orbit, it is expected that there will be between 1 day and 1 month's worth of the same debilitating conditions they just escaped every February and August, so they might have to get used to it. However, this is where the book takes an interesting turn. Remember when I said that the scientists were constantly incorrectly predicting the activity and behavior of the cloud? Well, there's a good reason for that, and it has less to do with the intelligence of the scientists and more to do with the intelligence of the cloud. It started with the deceleration instead of acceleration of the cloud as it approached the Earth, and ended with the scientists' inability to communicate with everyone else on the Earth through radio waves. There were just so many strange things that the cloud seemed to be doing that the scientists finally started to think about a possibility that they would have thought was inconceivable just a year earlier. What if the cloud is sentient? They devise a way to communicate with the cloud by transmitting a code, and they include mathematical and scientific concepts in hopes that the cloud would be able to receive it and decipher that information. And after the usual trial and error approach, they're finally able to communicate with the cloud. While the cloud responds, it responds with quick and short sentences. More information is required for it to be able to better grasp the English language, as well as concepts that might seem foreign to it, such as culture or emotions like love. While the cloud does experience feelings like joy and pain, it doesn't experience something like love because the way in which the cloud reproduces is vastly different than the way that humans reproduce. The cloud tells the scientists that there are sentient clouds elsewhere in the universe as well, and that they can communicate with each other. They generally just find the closest star that's next to them so they can go over there and fuel up on the star's energy, kind of like a gas station. The scientists eventually decide to inform the world governments that the cloud is sentient and that they are in communication with it. But they decide to hold off on allowing them to communicate with the cloud and say that it's because of a technical hiccup that currently they're the only ones that can speak to it. And to be honest, this sounds perfectly reasonable. I mean, think about it in current terms. What would happen if adversarial countries were in communication with this cloud independently? Who could you trust? How would you know that they were being honest about what it is that the cloud was telling them and what they were telling the cloud? It just adds a whole new layer of complexity and confusion in a situation that already has more than enough of that. So anyways, the scientists and the cloud continue to exchange information about each other, they learn from each other, and the cloud is actually surprised to find life on a solid planet, seemingly hearkening to the author's belief in panspermia, a theory that proposes that life likely didn't originate on Earth, but originated elsewhere under much more favorable conditions, and that the ingredients for life were transported here through means such as a meteor or space dust. It's from this that an interesting discussion regarding the origin of life erupts. Does life tend to originate in areas of low gravity? If so, then is the universe filled with life that we simply don't understand because it's so diametrically opposed to what we're accustomed to? I mean, is it even possible for us to conceive of such a thing? Would we even recognize alien life if it were to be presented to us? However, it's through the invocation of these questions that the next big theme of the book begins to prop up. Up until this point, the cloud has been perfectly cordial with the group of scientists. The cloud even agrees to nudge itself a little bit so that the humans can go on about their lives as normal without having to be worried about not getting enough energy from the sun. And they seem to be genuinely interested in communicating with each other and learning more from each other. Even though the cloud is vastly more intelligent than our entire species combined, again, it's still surprised to have found life at all on a solid planet, so it wants to learn more. However, world governments are absolutely terrified at the prospect that the cloud has the ability to completely wipe out all life on Earth. So they decide to do what they do best. They blow it up. They send rockets toward the cloud hoping to kill it. The scientists, knowing that the cloud is not malicious, decide to inform the cloud, and the cloud, while angry, acknowledges that the scientists had nothing to do with it and reverses the course of the rockets being aimed towards it. However, after that situation, the cloud goes silent, and seemingly out of nowhere, it begins to leave. And this is a huge bummer for the scientists because they were waiting for the situation to stabilize, for them to ask the big existential philosophical questions to the cloud. Questions like, how did life originate? Where does life come from? Is there a God? Are there even more intelligent species than the cloud? They weren't able to ask these questions. The cloud is just leaving, and they don't know why. It turns out that the questions that plague our species, questions such as where do we come from? How does life originate? Are there life forms out there that are so technologically and intellectually advanced that they can be viewed as indistinguishable from a god? The cloud also ponders those questions. And while it may have a much better understanding of these questions than humans do, it still doesn't have definitive answers. The scientists finally get back in communication with the cloud, and it turns out that the cloud isn't leaving because the humans fired rockets at it. It's actually leaving for a completely unrelated reason. The cloud tells the story of an event that happened around 2,000 million years ago, where another cloud communicated to everybody that they found the answers to these daunting existential questions. However, before the cloud was able to transmit the information, communication with the cloud just came to an abrupt end, and nobody was able to find or communicate with that cloud anymore. It seemed to have just blinked out of existence. Other clouds went to the location where that cloud was at when it transmitted the information, but there were no remnants of the cloud to be found anywhere, just nothing. It seemed to have vanished without a trace. And this makes sense in some ways, because we're talking about intergalactic distances here. So by the time another cloud arrives to investigate, the cloud that made the original transmission, whether it decided to off itself or it blew up or whatever, those remnants would have been long gone by now. And the same thing happened around 400 million years ago, where another cloud claimed to have found the answers, only for it to vanish shortly after. And just now, during the current events of the novel, it happened again. The cloud immediately makes a beeline towards it, hoping to reach it before it completely dissipates, leaving no remnants to analyze. Are the clouds choosing to off themselves after finding out such information, or is something else forcing them to off themselves? Or is it something far more incomprehensible? The cloud states, it seems as if there may be inherent limitations of a physical nature to the type of information that can be exchanged between intelligences. The suspicion is that an absolute bar exists to the communication of information relating to the deep problems. It seems as if any intelligence that attempts to pass on such information gets itself swallowed up in space. That is, space closes about it in such a fashion that no communication of any sort with other individuals of a similar hierarchy is possible. As scary as it sounds, maybe the cloud is right. Maybe the reason why we'll never be able to answer these daunting questions that plague us so much is because we can't. You can try to explain complex physics to a 2-year-old toddler as much and best as you possibly can, but at some point that toddler is not going to be able to comprehend what you're saying. What you are speaking about, what you are saying, just intellectually is too complex for that 2-year-old toddler to comprehend. How do we know that we, as adults, also don't have such a cap on our intelligence? Should we assume that given our evolved conscious ability to reason, that we should be able to comprehend and understand any answer that is thrown at us, or any problem that exists out there we should be able to solve? I know David Deutsch argues yes, but in reality, is that something that we can accomplish? Are we truly that different from other animals such as dogs and cows that surely could never even begin to comprehend existential questions such as the ones that plague us? If this super intelligent life form that travels intergalactic distances and has been alive for longer than the entire human species has even existed for is also perplexed by these questions, what chance do we possibly have? The cloud agrees to share information about the universe to the humans. However, it can't physically convey this information in a way that humans would be able to understand it. The cloud can't write down the answers and present it. It has to show you in some way. The cloud sends instructions on how to build a contraption that the humans can use to receive the cloud's knowledge. However, the contraption can only be used by one person at a time, so they select one of the main scientists in the novel, named Dave Weikart, to use it, to be the first person to sit on the chair. It's kind of what it looks like, and they use it. Weikart sits on the contraption, and the cloud begins to relay its knowledge. Unfortunately, however, it proves to be too much for him, and he passes away before being able to communicate with anyone what he experienced. Kingsley decides to try himself, and he asks the cloud to transmit the information at a much slower pace, because maybe the issue was just information overload. Alas, however, Kingsley ultimately suffers the same fate. However, unlike Weikart, who lost consciousness and never regained it after the cloud's transmissions, Kingsley was conscious and communicated for a brief time before he passed. After the transmission was over, Kingsley's face would start to twitch and contort, and there were times where he would just start uncontrollably screaming. The only way to stop it would be to sedate him, and so they'd need to sedate him. Kingsley was able to maintain sanity for about an hour. However, eventually he returned back to his terror-filled fits that marked the end of his life. After performing an autopsy, the scientists realized that the cloud didn't rewire or remove anything within the brain necessarily, but rather it just added new information alongside the old. As one of the scientists remarked, it was like a more extreme version of implanting modern scientific knowledge into the brain of an ancient Greek. All of a sudden, the ancient Greek has their entire understanding of how the world ought to work completely turned on its head. If someone can have an existential crisis after losing their religion, imagine how much worse it would be after losing everything, losing your sense of self, your sense of others, your sense of reality. Maybe we're not meant for such information. Maybe we didn't evolve with the proper hardware to be able to handle it, to be able to take it. Maybe it is physically impossible to ever have the answers to the questions that we so desperately seek out. And this is where the story ends, forcing us to come to grips with the possibility that we may never get the answers to the questions that keep so many of us awake at night, because maybe the answers would make us want to stay asleep, never to wake up again.